Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Faulkner, Chair of ASOR's Committee on Archaeological Research and Policy. It's my pleasure to be moderator for tonight's edition of the Friends of ASOR webinar series. We'll be hearing from three accomplished archaeologists tonight discussing their programs for the near future. And the topic for tonight is Back to the Field, Recent Discoveries and Summer Plans 2022. We'll be hearing from Lorenzo Delfonzo, Kathryn Grossman, and James Strange. I want to mention that we have another webinar coming up on April 24th, and we hope that you will likewise join us for that. We'll be hearing from Oystein LaBianca, Elizabeth Osinga, and Daryl Roll on preserving cultural heritage at Hispan and Jamal Jordan. You can check on this by visiting the ASOR website, by keeping an eye on inbox for announcements for this upcoming webinar. Before we start tonight, I want to mention a few things about these projects and about the Committee for Archaeological Research and Policy. The projects you'll be hearing about tonight are all affiliated with CAP, and as such, this provides these projects a means for supporting the professional policies on fieldwork and on professional conduct at national meetings that ASOR has put together in recent years. It also means that they are, the staff and students of these projects are eligible to apply for research grants, and students can apply for scholarships and fellowships. And I might mention likewise that ASOR is broadening its geographic purview. The project just needs to be in the greater Mediterranean region. And likewise, the project staff does not need to be housed in North America. They can reside professionally anywhere. We're happy to solicit and review applications for affiliation anytime. Our first speaker tonight is Lorenzo Delfonzo, who is Professor of Archaeology and History of Ancient Western Asia at ISOR, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, and he's Associate Professor of Archaeology of Ancient Western Asia at Pavia University. Dr. Delfonzo has excavated in Italy, Syria, directed a survey in southern Cappadocia, Turkey, and tonight he'll be talking about his newest project that he's been directing since 2011 at Nide Kinik Höyük. So with no further ado, let's welcome Lorenzo to the screen to tell us about his project and impending plans. Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the kind introduction, and hello, good evening, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here and to present the results of the last 2 years. So despite COVID, we've been able to go to the field, even though, of course, the program was really reduced, and nonetheless, we shared with our colleagues and workers in the excavation the need to close a cycle that was a 10 years cycle before starting a new one, which in fact started last year, and I will tell you a little bit more about that. You see, Kinik Höyük is multi-occupational excavations that is located on the Anatolian Plateau in Turkey, and in a region that is very well known to everyone interested in cultural tourism, which is Cappadocia. It's in the southern part of it. Here you get an idea of the site that consists of a central mound on top of a terrace. The two altogether cover a surface of circa 9 hectares, and then there is a lower town. What you also see is that the site has a very long history of occupation. I didn't mention here the period 1 of Kinik Höyük, which is short-lived occupation in the Seljuk and early Ottoman period of what must have been a camp, a seasonal camp, for all other periods. So from the early Bronze Age down to the late Hellenistic period, this was an urban site of regional significance. In this almost 12 years, because in 2010 we had a geophysical campaign already at the site, we developed, as all the sites with several occupation phases and running for a long time, several research questions. Today, I just want to present you some ideas of those we've been working on in the last 2 years, and we really wish to be back and start working again in the summer. So let me start with the early Iron Age, the early Bronze Age at Kinik Höyük. I only prepared one slide on this to present the work of two members of our team, Nancy Hycock and Elvisa Matessi, who published in 2021 the materials, the ceramic materials, that is clear evidence, together with the 14C dates, that is clear evidence of the occupation of the site during this early period, and early Bronze Age 1 and 2, besides 3, are attested on the site. And while the materials have been found both on the slope of the citadel, but they are of the mound, but they are never in primary context. We had some in primary context here in the bottom left of our screen in the lower town. So this tells us that the history of Kinik Höyük as a regional urban center might go back to these early times. One of the reasons to start excavating Kinik Höyük in 2011, after the intensive survey, was that we could find already on the surface ceramics for the late Bronze and the early Iron Age. As you might know, the late Bronze, early Iron in central Anatolia was for a long time thought to be only and exclusively disruptive with the end of the Hittite Empire, and possibly then 400 years of absence of occupation. Now, with the beginning of our new millennium, after 2000s, a series of articles started to come out showing that there is, in fact, occupation and presence in the early Iron Age in central Anatolia, but a level of complexity for which we have infrastructure and urban infrastructures is not so often found. That what we see here is the evidence for early Iron Age walls built directly on top of late Bronze Age fortifications on the citadel in Operation A, and a similar level of infrastructure and complexity has emerged also on the southern side of the citadel, where we've found some subterranean granaries in the Hittite tradition, but in the post-Hittite period. So this brought clear evidence of a continuity of complexity that might have had 100 years of interruption, but that tells us a story on the plateau that was otherwise unknown. It now seems that Gordian is also going to develop such an early a period for construction of its walls, and this is under publication and study. Another topic that concerned the early centuries of the first millennium BC, and that is really fresh, so it's going to be published on Anatolian Studies this year, is the results on the topic of wine production and exclusive wine drinking in our region. As you can see in this slide, you see a reconstructed crater in the typical Alisher 4 silhouette, stags and wild goats motifs. What is interesting is that first, at Kinik Höyük, we could find all of the vessels belonging to these, for Central Anatolian, particularly well-known class, in our Kinik Höyük period 5A, that covers more or less a time between 1000 to 800 BC. So we could offer for the first time a quite clear chronology on the period, on the most important period of circulation of these ceramics. It is also important to note that if studying the shapes of the ceramic set, characterized by the presence of the silhouette deer motifs and the concentric circles, this is a typical drinking set, and the study of the composition of the ware showed that looking at all the vessels and fragments found at the site, 2/3 of the vessels were locally produced, whereas some were imported. So this means there is a quite complex pattern of circulation of this ware that is very rare at each side, in each assemblage, very well decorated. So this is considered an exclusive set, and it is associated in our hypothesis with an exclusive right for wine drinking, wild wine. Why wine? Because in our region, besides the production of this pottery, we could also see by archaeobotanical studies an increase in presence at the site of remains from grapes or vines, starting exactly in this period and then growing in the next period. And also at the end of this period, there are several figurative representations of a local storm god of the vineyard. So this line of investigation on the role of wine drinking and its importance in defining elites in this region, and how that compares with other, of course, other rights to define elites through wine in other Mediterranean regions, is another main topic that we are developing. Now, if we come to the work on the ground, in the field that we are doing now, in the last 2 years, we have been excavating a large Middle Iron Age building on the northern side of the site, just inside of the citadel walls. And you see here the hall bringing inside of the main 6 by 10 meters big rectangular court of this building, and in the picture to the bottom right of this slide, you see this squared installation that has on the easternmost side a number of pyrotechnical installations, very likely for cooking, and then a sort of rectangular bench, also with some smaller fireplaces, but possibly also for seat and participate in the production of food. This was also associated with one in following sub-phases, other pits with trash deposits also associated with cooking activity. And this was the first hint that this was not the regular oven and fire installation you expect in private buildings. We understood that we might really be in a cultic complex when excavating the next room, a portion of the next room. We could encounter a deposit of bones that, as per the work of my colleague Pam Crabtree, was absolutely unusual. So you see forelegs of scapulae of sheep and goats, and they almost are entirely only the right part. Now, there are in several Mediterranean culture, but also in Anatolia, at least for the previous Hittite period, evidence for these to be allotment for sacrifice for priests or for specific deities. So what we would like to do next year is really to continue the excavation of, you see also some very fine and unusual vessels that have been found in the same context. And we would like to expand towards the south and try to complete the excavation also of room R7. This is our goal, to try to see if we can find more clear evidence. This is to such an extent important because, as you might know, there is very little to no urban cultic building that has been excavated so far in central Anatolia. For the same period, this year, Marina Pucci from Florence University started excavating in the lower town where Nancy Hyker had excavated for several years. And following the results of the geomagnetic survey of 2020, she was trying to see if there might be evidence for outer walls of the city, as it might appear from the results of the geoelectric investigation done 2020. And you see to the right the results of our team, and not only Marina could bring to light evidence of this fortification, but possibly even evidence for a tower, possibly even of a tower. You see here in this orthophoto, you see clearly the tower protruding from the wall. And we would like really to keep excavating, to finish to excavating this tower, but to see if possibly this is a tower associated with a gate, as the circulation through the alley that they have excavated this year seem to hint. So this is also something we're very, very interested in. There is a later period at Kinik Höyük that never stops presenting incredible finds, and you see here a picture of the late Hellenistic sacred area with the great plaza in the center. And this is a picture of 2020. And well, the 2020, let me just say, is the year in which Denise Hucher completed the stabilization of the floor of the plaza with this magnificent project. She's now teaching architecture at Bilkent, and we really hope to keep her working with us in the next year. You see also the Northwestern Sanctuary to the west of the plaza, and there is where we have been excavating this year. At the same time, we have been expanding the excavation on the plaza towards the south and exploring the connection between the plaza and the court of the sanctuary, of the Northwestern Sanctuary. In the sanctuary, years ago, we had investigated the room 6. Is the first square room of 6 by 6, more or less, where there was a bench with some votive deposits of coins in the later period. Under the floor, in an earlier phase, there was this cache of animal with this real like bird of prey. Sorry. That is now also at the museum. In the adjoining room, storage, and from the analysis of the archaeobotanical period, again, the quantity of great pips led us suspect that this was not for grains, but in fact for storage of wine in the sanctuary, and the ladle also might hint in this direction, the ladle that was found in the room. Associated with the sanctuary, however, just outside of the sanctuary, there was something that was no less interesting, and it came first in the form of a debris, possibly also pushed through runoff from the southeastern side of the mound through the plaza, and as you see in the bottom right picture, it was a debris of a stone building, and when the stones were removed, an incredibly big quantity and variety of statues in ceramic came to light. And this started in 2018 and in fact never ended. It still continues, and every time that we open a new part of the plaza, we find these remains. What are they? Well, they are pieces of bovids. Some of them are complete pieces, and we have to imagine votives made by just legs, but some of them seems to be portions, fragmentary portions of life-size statues, like this one to the left. And I just let you show some that are smaller, bigger, but the bovid as a votive is really characteristic. This was reconstructed this year by Emily Frank, a student at ASOR, together with Fazıl Açıgöz. So he was professor of restoration at Nevşehir until last year, and started to work with us. Did a fantastic job. And also Isel Güngör. So all this has been now published on Near Eastern Archaeology of this issue and this month. So you can find all of this information and other, but please see how this local productions, so little Hellenistic, then is mixed to more typical Hellenistic motifs, figurative motifs, and so on, through molds and appliques to the statues of the bulls, as these that I'm showing here to you. All of this, we had the opening of the vitrine at the museum that was once again designed by Denis Uger and completed under the supervision of Roberta Casagrande, and of course all in collaboration with Jacopun Luller, the standing director at the Museum of Nide now. Let me just close with another find, that once all of this was removed, all this layer of debris, we could see that there were some pits in the floor of the Great Plaza. And in one of these pits, an eagle statue was found. And together with the eagle statue, there is this inscription. The last line reads, "Para ton dia," in front of Zeus. So we understood that there must be also a sanctuary for Zeus at the site. And we very much imagined that this should be just to the southeast of the plaza. That's where Burak Yolacan, the vice director and classical archaeologist of our team, is going to excavate this summer, next campaign. Let me just show you also in the other pit we found deposited was the marble eagle statue that is really marvelous. And this also became part of the permanent exhibition of the museum starting in 2019. And yes, these are the two areas where we would like to continue our excavation. So to finish and finally expose the southwestern side of the northwestern sanctuary. So to start the on-site restoration of it, and then go for the Zeus temple that is announced by the inscription I showed you before. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was great. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Our next speaker tonight is Kathryn Grossman. She is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at North Carolina State University. She's an archaeologist and zooarchaeologist. She works on a number of different kinds of questions theoretically, including resistance to state making, the biographies of early cities, and human-animal relationships in early complex societies in the Near East and Greater Mediterranean. She directs the Makounta-Voules Archaeological Project in Cyprus. She's likewise previously been senior staff member on projects in Syria, Cyprus, Egypt, and Iraq. And so with no further ado, let's welcome Kate to the screen to tell us about Makounta-Voules.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I'll just share my screen here. There we go. You'll see that okay? Okay. All right. Yeah, so thank you all for joining me today on this webinar. And after 2 years of curtailed field research for us at Makounta-Voules, we are so excited to be headed back to the field in Cyprus this summer. So today I want to give you a sense for some of the big questions that guide and inform our work at the archaeological site of Makounta-Voules Mersinouthia, show you some of our preliminary results, and talk about plans for 2022. At Makounta, my team and I are exploring the possibility that Cyprus during the late Chalcolithic period, which dates from roughly 27 to 2400 BC, might provide an early example of a so-called society against the state. And so I want to start by talking about what we mean by society against the state and why this might be a useful way of thinking about Cyprus during this period. So archaeologists have, since the 1960s or so, been interested in the evolution of human societies from simple bands of hunters and foragers to more complex social organizations like states. States are, in anthropological terms, large-scale societies with complex economies and hierarchical and bureaucratic political organizations. In this evolutionary perspective, then, the simpler societies are generally assumed to represent the losing side of history. And despite a lot of critique of this generalized view of the evolution of human societies, it's been kind of difficult to dislodge the idea of the state, this kind of society that we all live in today, as the natural endpoint of human social evolution. In recent years, archaeologists have drawn particular attention to this idea of societies against the state, societies whose members deliberately and thoughtfully attempted to avoid the process of state formation or being subsumed by nearby expanding states. And these anti-states have often proven successful and durable forms of socio-political organization. And what's pretty clear is that as soon as there were early states, there were also societies against the state. Now, the ancient Near East provides the sort of classic case study for early state formation, with kingdoms and city-states in evidence as early as 3500 BC or so. It's becoming clear, though, that this took place within a regional context that included resistance to the process. Recent work suggests that non-state and maybe anti-state groups occupied a broad swath of the mountainous regions around Mesopotamia, and as we suggest, regions as far afield as Cyprus. The widespread persistence and presence of these groups complicates our existing narratives of state formation, a process which, it's worth pointing out, left many inhabitants of those early states poor, indebted, enslaved, or worse. And there has been plenty of discussion of the interactions between the expanding states of the Near East and the societies on their periphery, but what's often been missing is an effort to consider those peripheral societies as truly viable alternatives. Now, Cyprus has played relatively little role in the broader discussion of state formation in the Near East. States didn't emerge in Cyprus until the middle to late Bronze Age, more than a millennium after they first appeared elsewhere in the region. While their neighbors were engaged in the momentous process of state formation, the inhabitants of Chalcolithic Cyprus appear to have maintained a village-based society with few signs of social rank or hierarchy or bureaucratic political formation. It's tempting then to take Cyprus as a case of stunted development, an island holdover from a simpler time that hadn't yet progressed along the path followed by societies in neighboring regions. But of course, there's an alternative, which is that the villagers of Chalcolithic Cyprus may have actively suppressed the accumulation of wealth, power, and authority. This is something that has previously been argued by other archaeologists, including the late Eddie Peltenberg. And we're now viewing this through the lens of society against the state and exploring the forms of political organization that supported the persistence of this small-scale village-based culture. So these are some of the big picture questions that my project is interested in. I want to shift gears and give you a little look at our site and on the region and some of the data we've collected so far. So the site of Makounta-Voules Archaeological is located in northwestern Cyprus near the modern town of Polis Chrysochous, a region where few prehistoric settlements have previously been excavated, and yet a region that seems, based on archaeological surveys, to have had substantial occupation in the Chalcolithic period and Bronze Age. Our site is located about 2 kilometers from the coast in the foothills of the Troodos Mountains. It sits on a gentle hill slope above the juncture of the Makounta River and a small, steeply dropping stream. The stream is here, the river kind of runs like that, with copper ore sources at the surface of neighboring hill slopes. The site is spread out over an area of cultivated and uncultivated land. So far, we've only surveyed and excavated in the cultivated areas, as those are the places most at risk of disturbance by the agriculture. The site has been known for some time. The Polish archaeologist Dariusz Malashewski published it as part of his survey of the region, and many other archaeologists visited both before and after him. In our conversations with farmers, landowners, and the members of the Forestry Service who patrol the national forest nearby, it's pretty clear that people who live in the area have been aware of the site for decades. In our first season, we mapped and collected artifacts on the surface of the site. And this mapping shows 2 highly localized area of prehistoric artifacts illustrated here. As you can see from the survey map, which shows late Chalcolithic sherds in yellow, and early or middle Bronze Age ceramic sherds in blue, these were recovered across a wide area, but with differing degrees of density. Only a very small handful of sherds from other periods were recovered, so we can pretty confidently say that the site was really only occupied in the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age. All right. We also recovered a good bit of copper slag across the site in most of the areas where you have the yellow and blue circles. So in 2018, we focused on testing the survey results through excavation. In 2019, we expanded those excavations to see more of the architecture and try and create some connections between the trenches. And we focused our attention on those areas where we had the densest concentration of ceramics. So this cluster of trenches here in area C, and this cluster here in Area A. In Area C, the archaeological preservation is rather shallow, less than half a meter between the surface of the ground and the bedrock, and it's really heavily impacted by recent agricultural plowing. However, the area is wide open with a lot of space to expand trenches. In Area A, on the other hand, preservation is comparatively deep, over a meter in some places, and we haven't yet hit bedrock in the Area A trenches. But there's a dense fruit orchard planted atop the archaeological site that makes it difficult to excavate broad exposures. So I'll talk about Area C first, then Area A, and then show you some of our artifacts. In 2018, when we began excavations in Area C, we came down on this structure. This is a late Chalcolithic round building set into a cut in the bedrock with just the lowest courses of the stone wall foundations preserved. Recent illicit cultivation has stripped away the upper levels, which were probably made of mud bricks, as well as much of the northern portions of the building. But we have good in situ remains for about a third of this whole structure. A central hearth, which is located right here, as well as an interior assemblage that's typical of Chalcolithic buildings. Lots of ceramics, including some that are intact, smashed in place, bone, antlers, stone tools, things like that. The walls themselves are made of sedimentary rocks, except for this set right here, where we have these large igneous cobbles, and this seems to be the threshold, the doorway to the building, which we can tell because this stone back here on the interior of the curved wall has a divot in it and probably serves as an interior door socket. So we have good evidence that other parts of Area C were also in use during the Chalcolithic period. Within a few meters of the round building, we found pits cut into the bedrock, like this one here. And about 20 meters away, we have a pair of conjoined pits that probably also date to the same period. We do think that we will eventually come down on other architecture in Area C, but it's likely to be preserved just at the lowest foundations, as this building was. Still, the continued excavation of trenches in Area C is definitely part of our plan for 2022. So as in Area C, we first opened the trenches in Area A in order to ground truth the results of the survey to see if what we had found in the survey was matched by the archaeological remains that were subsurface. And as you can see here, our trenches are kind of odd shapes. And this is because we are digging in an orchard and we have to put the trenches in between the trees and try and avoid damaging the root systems. So we began excavations in this area in 2018 by opening some long slot trenches running diagonally between the rows of the trees. And then in 2019, we extended the trenches into sort of T shapes to try and explore the relationships that we had uncovered in those long slots. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip talking about trenches 14 and 12, which have interesting but not particularly well understood stone features. So I'll start by talking about trench 1, look at it here, and then I'll talk about trench 13. So trench 1 is our second round Chalcolithic structure on the site. At the top here, we have a smashed vessel, shown right here with the arrow, that sits next to a big plaster feature that we don't quite understand yet. We also had a floor assemblage pushed up against the wall right here before it was cleared out. Like in Area C, this assemblage inside the structure had quite a lot of animal bone and stone tools. It's pretty clear, though, that the smashed pot and that floor assemblage seem to come from different floor levels. And so in 2022, we're going to try and explore this building further to see if there are indeed either multiple occupation phases or multiple superimposed buildings that aren't the same occupation. And this wouldn't be at all unusual for Chalcolithic structures. Our other focus in Area A is trench 13. We found a fire installation in this trench that appears to have consisted of a superstructure of burnt clay atop a pit. The superstructure had collapsed over the pit. You can see it in the course of excavation here. And when we excavated it, it was just a mass of burnt clay and ash. A carefully laid packing of small angular cobbles at the north side of the pit may have been an access point. To the north of the feature, we have this small wall, and it's pretty unlikely that the fire installation was inside the roofed space of a building, so probably this wall just delineates outdoor space for the activities related to this fire installation. We still don't know what this feature was used for, But given the intense and sustained heat of the fires that seem to have been within it, it seems at least possible that it was a pit furnace for copper smelting. We've collected, but not yet analyzed, charcoal samples for radiocarbon dating so we can get a better sense for the data this features. The ceramics from the trench suggest a late Chalcolithic date, but we'd like a radiometric date to be a little more certain. All right, so just to give you a quick overview of the kind of materials that we find at Makounta, our ceramics are being analyzed by Lisa Graham, and the high volume of sherds that we bring home from the field every day has been pretty overwhelming. The vast majority of our ceramics are late Chalcolithic and include deep bowls, spouted vessels, and quite a few large storage jars, suggesting that both food production, consumption, and distribution are all taking place at the site. It's worth pointing out that there haven't really been many scientific prehistoric excavations in this region of Cyprus, and so the ceramic sequence isn't fully established yet. And part of what we're hoping to do at Makounta is provide a well-excavated ceramic assemblage that can serve as the baseline for prehistoric sites in the region. We do have an extensive groundstone tool assemblage, part of which I'm showing you here, that's being analyzed by Andrew McCarthy. And this includes pretty typical food production and woodworking elements, adzes and axes, chisels, and then for food production, corns and rubbers and things like that. Some of our groundstone tools are really large and beautiful pieces, and the inhabitants of the site seem to have been gathering river cobbles from the Makounta River and working them on site. We have many that are in various stages of the production process. We also have chipped stone tools made of flint or chert, and we've got flaked blades, the cores from which those blades were struck, and all sorts of pieces of detritus from the process of making flaked stone tools, suggesting that both ground stone and chip stone tool production was taking place on site. Because I am a zooarchaeologist, I'm always interested in the animals, and I've been studying the animal bones from Makounta, assisted by my student Summer Shives. What we see at Makounta is pretty typical for the period in Cyprus. There's a real emphasis on meat production, with a heavy focus on meat from pigs and hunted dama or fallow deer. While we do have sheep and goat remains, they weren't herded in large numbers the way they were elsewhere in the Near East in this period. And they were probably mostly kept for their milk products, maybe a little bit of wool and hair, and then probably killed and eaten when the quality or quantity of those products had declined. One of the things that I find so interesting about the Chalcolithic period in Cyprus is that the heavy reliance in this period on hunting as a meat source reminds us that even in settled villages like this one, which date to thousands of years after animals were first domesticated in the Near East, many societies still relied on hunting for a good portion of their meat. We have found a wide range of small objects made of picrolite, which is kind of like a little bit like soapstone, sort of a soft, easily worked stone. And this picrolite comes from a stone source at the top of the Troodos Mountains in the center of the island, or it can be found washed down from the heights in one of two particular river basins. From our site, we have several carved human figurines, the one in the top center and top right, and then other pieces that are too fragmentary to really tell what they are. We also have both raw and worked but unfinished picrolite fragments. So like the stone tools, the inhabitants definitely seem to have been making these on site. Nat Erbsatulo is carrying out our metallurgical studies, and he reports that most of the slag we recovered in the survey is tap slag, which suggests that it's from the results of smelting on site. Whether or not we've actually identified properly the smelting furnace is up for debate. Nat examined the burned and collapsed fire installation in Trench 13, testing the elemental composition of the burnt clay, and he found that some of the samples show small amounts of copper in the clay, but it leaves us with just a tentative suggestion between slags that we have found on the surface and the possible suggestion that this fire installation was a pit furnace, that it might have been those things. It's still a little difficult to tell. One of the things that Nat Erbsatulo did discover when he joined us in 2019 was he surveyed this ridge across the site from Area A, where he found veins of copper green minerals basically on the surface of that ridge. There are a number of depressions in that ridge that might be the remains of mining activity. Some of these are probably modern, but there is a rounded river cobble near one of the depressions, which suggests perhaps some prehistoric use of the area. So in 2021, Tate Paulette and I surveyed this ridge, but it's pretty densely overgrown. And so part of our work in 2022 will be clearing and mapping this area. We are particularly interested to see if we can recover any artifacts that would allow us to date those cuts in the red bedrock to see if they're actually the result of prehistoric mining. So to bring this back to the big questions we raised at the beginning, what kind of contribution can Makounta make to discussions about societies about the state against the state? We have this village of round buildings, which so far seem to serve as domestic space. We have good evidence for household scale craft production and some interesting but tentative evidence for metallurgical crafting, and an animal economy focused really on like household level meat production. All of this seems to track with what we know about other Chalcolithic sites in Cyprus. Our next steps then are to understand the politics of how this village life plays out, both at Makounta and island-wide, in the face of interaction with neighboring state societies. If the inhabitants of Cyprus in the Chalcolithic period were practicing a decentralized household and village scale politics of more or less deliberate state avoidance during the period of the first millennium of state formation in the broader region, this is something that deserves to be highlighted. The island may very well offer a fascinating example of a durable and successful alternative to the radical political and social transformations that were gripping neighboring regions, and perhaps therefore a much needed antidote to evolutionary assumptions about the inevitability and superiority of the state. So in May and June of 2022, we will be back at Makounta with a team of 21 field school students from 5 universities and 10 staff members who are faculty and graduate students from universities across the US. We are optimistic that we can have a safe and productive season this year, and we're just so excited to be headed back to the field. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. That was great. I love to hear sort of counterintuitive perspectives on social evolution, and maybe we'll have a few questions about that later. Our next speaker will be James R. Strange. He has directed the Shikhin project since 2012 with Moti Abiam, Tom McCullough, and David Finzi as associate directors. He is the Charles Jackson Grenade and Elizabeth Donald Grenade Professor in New Testament Studies at Stanford University. With David Finzi, he's co-editor of the 2-volume set Galilee in the Late Second Temple and Mishnaic Periods, and his new book, One Problem After Another, An Introduction to Archaeology, the Gospels, and First Century Roman Galilee is scheduled to be published this year, 2022. So let's welcome James front and center and hear about his upcoming work.
Well, thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking all the organizers of this webinar. It's really lovely. It's also been wonderful to hear the other 2 presenters and to hear about their excitement at returning to the field that we share. Also, I was very pleased to see that about 13 or 14 members of the Shikhin Excavation Project have joined. And including about 7 first-timers. So it's lovely to see you guys. So I'm going to begin by showing you where Shikhin is located in the Galilee in Israel. You may not have heard of the site, and that makes sense because it's only mentioned a couple of times as a sochus in Josephus, and then as Shikhin in some Talmudic or pre-Talmudic literature. But here it is located about dead center, geographically speaking, in the southwestern corner of the Beit Netofa Valley. If you're familiar with Josephus's writings or with the New Testament Gospels, you've heard of some of these sites that I'll point out to you, nearby sites, Sepphoris or Tzipori, later Caesarea, the large city right nearby, Nazareth, which all Gospels locate as the town of Jesus. We have the town of Yodfat, very important in the Jewish war with Rome, Khibet Kana, which is one of the possibilities for Cana of Galilee mentioned by Gospel of John, Kafar Kana, another possibility, Tiberias, Magdala or Tarikia, Capernaum, which ends up being one of the headquarters for Jesus' ministry in the Synoptic Gospels. Bethsaida, well, there are two possible sites. I've highlighted one which has been identified as a site for a long time now, but there's an alternative site now being excavated close to the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Chorazin does not really show up much in the Gospels except as a place that Jesus curses, which suggests that either he or his disciples did do some preaching there that wasn't well received. I want to point out that Shikhin, a small village, sits on a major intersection. So we have this large highway that becomes an important Roman highway from Akko or Ptolemais on the coast of the Mediterranean down to Tiberias eventually, when Tiberias gets built somewhere between 18 and 20 AD. And then this inland leg of the Via Maris, which hooks up with this highway and then joins with the highway running along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, eventually crossing to the eastern side of the Jordan River and making its way to Damascus and then to other parts of the known world. So Cephras, the large city, overlooks this intersection, but so does Shikhin. And I think Shikhin takes advantage of these highways. Here is the site before being excavated when we surveyed it in 2011. You can tell that there are olive groves on top. The olive groves, I think, except for this one here, are located on the east. We're looking northeast, by the way. I think most of these olive trees predate the end of the mandate in 1948, so the beginning of Israel. You see the truck on the highway. This is Highway 77, following fairly well right here the route of the old Roman highway. Here is the future home of Field 1 that we're excavating now as our main archaeological field. And across the valley, you can't see it very well, so I'll circle it. You can see Khibet Kana, or the ruin of Cana, just right across the Beit Netofa Valley. I think all of our sites that you've seen this evening are located in very lush regions. I want to begin by talking about the synagogue, perhaps I should say putative synagogue at Shikhin. This is what the non-excavation looked like in 2011 when we surveyed it. This is actually in October, long after the survey had ended. We're looking eastward at an Islamic period terrace wall put in to retain soil and moisture on the top part of the hill when agriculture began. You can see my hat sitting there just above the word eighth. So we too have to avoid trees, and you will see places in our archaeological trenches or squares where we have made room for trees. Well, this ends up being the place where we sink our first archaeological squares because we ended up discovering several architectural fragments in this terrace wall. So here they are before excavating. Here's an upside down column base. You may wonder why I say it's upside down. Well, that's because we excavated it and we could turn it over. You can see broken volutes of Ionic capitals and a column drum. Here is what that upside down capital looked like once we had dug out all the earth from around it. I say we, I didn't do any of the digging. Then on the right-hand side, as it sits now at nearby Tsipori National Park, a very large attic type base. Here is a badly battered Ionic capital on the left. The square that it came from is on the right, which had several pieces of architectural fragments in that terrace wall. So what you're looking at, that wall in the upper right-hand corner of the square photo, are the remnants of that Islamic wall, with most of the stones removed from around the architectural fragments so that they can be seen. So here is a column base, here is a column capital, here is a column drum, here's another drum peeking out of this temporary bulk, which is one of those that we have to retain the olive tree you see in the lower right-hand side of the screen. And here is Max. This was the first piece of architecture that we found that convinced us that we probably could argue with some confidence that we had a synagogue. This is a very badly battered drum for a heart-shaped column. The top part, which is white and orange from lichen, that's the part that was exposed. So it's sitting very close to a wall that at first we thought was a stylobate, turned out to be probably the exterior wall of the synagogue. Here is a tipped architectural fragment. It's a threshold. Here is the other half of the threshold upside down. I'll show you it set in place momentarily. We also found a very badly battered and broken piece of a heart-shaped column in the terrace wall. Here is that threshold, very large threshold, set, we think, in the correct place, marking the exterior of the building and the interior of the building, which was built over silos that had been cut into the bedrock that had existed before the synagogue was built. In the lower left-hand side of the screen, you see part of the foundation for what we now think is the stylobate for the interior of the synagogue. Stylobate refers to a low wall on which columns sat. And the reason that heart-shaped columns are so important is that they mark where two rows of columns meet at right angles to one another. And we find that typically in, say, porches with colonnaded, shaded porticos around it, and then also on the interior of some buildings, like some synagogues. So this was a very large threshold, by the way. It's just massive. That door would have measured somewhere around 3 feet wide, the double leaf door. I want to show you the excavation squares and just a line drawing of the squares. So in square 13, which is not square at all, you can see those two silos cut into the bedrock. Here is that, what we think is the exterior wall. Here is the heart-shaped column as it was found. Here are the two pieces of threshold as they were found. Here's that bit of what we think is stylobate. We extended, we projected where we would find it, and sure enough, we found it out here. We think this bit of bedrock here marks the exterior wall of the synagogue. We projected it into square 26. Sure enough, we found it sitting there as well. So we have hypothesized that the synagogue looks something like this in plan. The black parts being the parts that we have excavated, and the dashed parts being the parts that we hypothesize. It would have been a fairly large building, about 12 meters wide on its facade, facing southeast, which we think interior columns. I've only marked where we think the heart-shaped columns would go on their stylobates, with some type of room to the northeast here, and an associated, we think, plastered pool, maybe a mikveh. It's very hard to say. It's very badly battered. In addition to this synagogue, we have a ceramics industry. Now, the ceramics industry dates to the 1st century AD into, we think, about the 2nd or 3rd century AD, maybe also into the 4th. We're struggling hard to get a full picture of the occupation of the site because we have really only mixed soil loci, or mostly mixed soil loci, with pottery ranging all the way from the late Hellenistic period, so the 2nd century BC, into the 4th century CE. Very few soil layers that can help us date with great clarity a single occupational layer. So I want to take you now to square 124, where we found a very odd looking little installation, which everyone who looked at it, all of the archaeologists who stood here on the East Balk and looked at that thing, identified as a kiln. And all of them said, it's the smallest kiln that I've ever seen. I'll show it to you here in just a moment. But right now, I want to point out something that was found just northwest of that kiln, next to a wall when we removed this balk. So here we are looking at that blank spot, and you can see this small square piece of stone sitting in the soil as it was found. Actually, the person who found it took it out to look at it, so we reset it and put the scale there to take a photograph of it. When we turned it over, we had what you see on the right. We had clearly, to us, the mold for making the top part of a decorated lamp, known as a Darom lamp, a southern lamp. Darom means southern. this type is made in the north, so in Hebrew it's called a northern darom, or a northern southern lamp. This was significant because we had been finding well over 30 fragments of molds for making lamps of different types, mostly this type and one other type. All of them badly broken. This is the first one that we had that was nearly completely preserved. You can see that this lower right-hand corner, left-hand corner is broken, but it completely preserves the pattern, which is tendrils, grape leaves, grape clusters. And then here, what is sometimes called an amphora, maybe a vase, looks like it might have been broken. And so maybe this mold was broken in when it was being made. So this is at least evidence of the manufacture of lamp molds. The kiln that I'm getting ready to talk to you about is evidence of actually making lamps. I want to point out to you another mold that was found earlier. This one is important for two reasons. One, because it preserves this hole and this perfect circle, actually two rings, at least two rings of a perfect circle in this badly calcified example. So we know that they're using compasses or compass-like instruments to mark out and carve out this mold. This is for the bottom part of the same kind of lamp. But also you can see the arc of another circle here that's used to lay out the arc of the nozzle. So I want you to pay attention to that. Also pay attention to the backside, the bottom, which is curved. And it has these odd grooves in it. We'll return to that momentarily, but that was terribly puzzling at first, and we managed to work out, we think, what's going on there. Let's return to the kiln. So here it is, fully excavated down to the floor of the kiln. So when I mean floor, I mean the bottom floor. There's nothing below this that is not kiln. There's actually another floor that's missing that would have sat on top of this central pillar and stretched between it and the nearby stones. It would have had holes in it, and we would have stacked our wares on top of that in what's called the ware chamber in the firing of the vessels inside it. Here it is side by side in 2017 on the left and 2018 on the right, after we sectioned completely through it all the way to bedrock. Couple of things I want you to pay attention to. Well, really one, I guess. We've removed now the column over here. And I want you to point out to you these little pieces of brick on the interior. And every once in a while, you can see a very nicely formed semicircle here and here. And here's a piece of one you can barely see. These are fragments of kiln floor that are now used inside this kiln. In a discussion with our technologist, I've been saying, well, there must be another kiln nearby because they're using fragments of those kilns in this kiln. And he said, no, those are probably fragments of this kiln, by which he means that the floor, after several firings, gives way due to the thermic shock of being heated and cooled and heating and cooled. So we simply dismantle the floor, use it then to replace tiles on the inside of the kiln that have been damaged as well. So we may be using the kiln itself to repair the kiln. Here is Jen drawing the section of the kiln. She's online now, as a matter of fact. I've been chatting with her on my phone. And here's Toby. Toby is the one who found that lamp mold that I told you about. And here are a little bit more clearly some pieces of kiln floor, we think, being used to line the interior of the kiln. So here is why we think it must be used for small vessels. Here it is sort of mocked up to scale in this line drawing, this hypothetical line drawing. And there is a Shikhin storage jar, a type of storage jar that many think was manufactured at our site. And you can see that the kiln, if I've reconstructed it correctly, the kiln is much too small to fire such a large vessel, or many vessels really of any type, unless they're rather small vessels. Well, here on the left is a darom lamp. Here it is below, as we found it in the excavation, and here it is after cleaning, and in its nice photographed by Gabriel Aron. And on the right is a small bowl that was found inside the kiln. Here are other fragments of lamps. This one found below the kiln, so maybe part of an earlier firing from another kiln, and this one found next to the kiln. This one shows myrtles, myrtle berries and leaves. This one we think pomegranates. What's interesting about this one is that they forgot to cut out the wick hole before they fired it. So this is what we call a waster. This is something that, well, maybe it could have been used, but it would not have functioned in the same way as this lamp over here. We actually have two lamps of this pattern, we think made in the same mold. So we think the kiln was dedicated to the firing of oil lamps. Well, the most exciting thing that we're going to be doing this summer is a bit of experimental archaeology. So let me tell you a little bit about that. Here is the floor for the experimental kiln that Yeshu Dre and Ilana Gonen are right now manufacturing. They're going to put together a reconstructed first century lamp kiln based on what we have, the technology that we have at Shikhin. They're going to do it at their restoration of ancient technology grounds. They're going to build two, one that they will cover to keep the elements from getting to it, and one that they will leave exposed so they can track entropy over time. Here it is. This is actually an upside down photograph. Yeshu has made the tiles for the interior column. He stacked them on top of the floor. I simply inverted the slide so that I could do this and show you how the kiln floor works. So we have heated air blowing in from the firebox, flowing through the holes and up into the wear chamber. So the wares, including the lamps, would have been stacked on top of this floor. All right, so back to the lamp molds. So here is that lamp mold that I showed you that is, as we found it, in place, upside down. For a long time, we wondered about its shape, and then we realized we think that we were seeing waste materials from the manufacture of these soft chalk cups, which are ubiquitous at Jewish village sites in Galilee and south in Judea. Here are two pieces found at our site. One, as we showed them to our volunteers, and another one on the right, photographed in the studio. And here is one that was broken in the process of being created. So the exterior is carved roughly. This is the aesthetic. They're supposed to look like this on the exterior. The interior is cut away on a lathe. So the thing spins horizontally, and we cut it away with a lathe chisel. And this one was broken because, of course, this is not supposed to be the rim of the vessel. It's supposed to be up here. So normally we would carve down and then eventually pop out this interior core, leaving these waste materials. This is at a site not too far from Shikhin called Reina, where in two different areas, they have remnants of this soft chalk cup industry. You can see it's near a dump now. It's being covered by trash. But I went there with Yeshu Dre in 2019 and recovered some of these cores. And what he did with the cores was to try to recreate the process for making one of these lamps. So I return you to the interior shot, showing you the place again for the compass, and that allows us to inscribe the circles. So here is a lamp. Here is the pattern that Yeshu thinks that they inscribed on the face of the lamp mold in order to help them carve the bits away to make the lamp. If we remove the picture of the lamp, we get what we decided would be the Shikhin Excavation Project logo. So that's another piece of experimental archaeology that Yeshu has helped us out with. Here he is conducting a lamp production workshop in San Diego in 2019 at the ASOR meeting there. They're doing two things. On the left-hand side, she's showing you about how to carve decorations into the mold. On the left, he's showing how to press the mold, the clay into the mold. Here is that same, oh no, here's my favorite lamp made from that workshop. I can't remember where the student was from, but she made this lovely hippopotamus lamp. Here is that same workshop being conducted for our volunteers in Nazareth. We'll have another one of those this summer, and Yeshu will use the lamps made in that workshop and others as well to fire in the two kilns that he and Ilana build. So I end with this slide showing you our website and showing you how to get there if you would like to volunteer for this season or for a new season. And you can see I've circled the Shikhin Excavation Project logo there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, James. That was great. Again, all three talks have been really interesting and stimulating. I'd like to start off with a few questions. I'd like to remind the audience, and I think Felice has as well, that if you'd like to post questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, we will see if we can work those in. Kate, I wanted to ask you a question to start with. What kind of evidence would you look for to either affirm or refute a hypothesis of active resistance against social differentiation and state formation? Or on Cyprus, could the lack of the state be merely passive, that is due to low population densities, natural environment with a lot of resources that have not been depleted the way they were in the Middle East? What do you think?
Yeah, so there is actually some evidence from other Chalcolithic sites of some pretty active resistance to the accumulation of wealth and power. At Kasanaga, there was a building that dated to the Chalcolithic period that where someone seems to have been maybe hoarding a little bit too much in storage vessels, and that building seems to have been burnt down with potentially someone inside. There are also there's some evidence that sort of near the beginning of the late Chalcolithic period, you get some tombs that are quite a bit larger and more impressive than other tombs at the site of Suskiu-Laona, and those tombs are very quickly co-opted and filled with other bodies. And so it seems like there's this attempt to anytime, and we don't have that many Chalcolithic sites, right? And what we're seeing is that at, I don't know, a third of the Chalcolithic sites where there's evidence for someone attempting to do something a little grander than their neighbors, that seems to be pretty quickly shut down. And so what we're thinking at Makounda is what we're hoping for in Area A is some change over time in some of these buildings where we can see whether or not we have those kinds of sort of attempts to push back, if that makes sense.
It does. No, that's an interesting angle.
Yeah.
And I would argue that I think they're probably, although I don't have examples that I can offer, that it strikes me based on our own work in Cyprus in the Middle Bronze Age, things are still pretty undifferentiated socially in a lot of these communities, and this persists for quite a long time.
Yeah, it seems to persist for a long time,
yeah. Which
is, I think, a testament to the value of that kind of system, at least for the Cypriots, for the prehistoric Cypriots.
Lorenzo, I wanted to ask you a question. I was really struck by your bovid statuary. Can you expand a little bit on the other evidence that goes with it? For example, do you have statuary of any other animal taxa, or is it just bovines? And is that mirrored in the faunal assemblage? Is that heavily skewed toward cattle bones? And is there any evidence of sacrifice, for example? What's the statuary used for? Is it just depictive, or is there some other aspect to it?
No, thank you very much for the question. So this has been partially studied by two classical archaeologists. One is Dr. Casagrande Kim from ASOR, and one is from Pavia, Dr. Gorini. And it is a very interesting pattern there. So the sacred area of the city mainly dates to the late Achaemenid and Hellenistic period, and to the late Hellenistic period. Now, in the earliest period, there is exclusively, as far as statuary, but also figurines and so on are concerned, zoomorphic figurines, and they are all bovids and birds of prey exclusively. And how to interpret them? Well, for the bovids, we have no doubts, because some of them, particularly in the later period, are inscribed, and there are dedicatory inscriptions in Greek, so that makes things easier. It really seems that bovids were sacrificial animals in that case, and the votives would just remind the community the sacrifice by one devout individual within the community. Different is the discourse about the birds of prey, and I showed this marble eagle, this marvelous this eagle perching on a wild goat that lies on the floor. So the whole iconography is has a long tradition in Anatolia, but long story short, it has then been associated very likely with the cult of Zeus, and particularly how it was venerated on the Erciyes, the Argaius mountain, the big volcano next to Kayseri today. What is fascinating, as you might have seen, is that, well, in the way these later birds, marble statues and so on have been produced, there is a clear influence of classical Hellenistic art. But if you look at the urban organization, if you look at the architecture, all of that is very local and goes back at least to the Iron Age. And one starts seeing the hybridization taking place really only in the second half of the 2nd century, so much later than in all the rest of Anatolia. We are in a borderland in that sense, and non-animal figurative figurines only start to appear in the 1st century BC, and there you have the Olympic gods applied really to the traditional ceramic statues. I just want to remember, for those who do not study Anatolia, that ceramic statues of bovines have a very long story going back to at least the 2nd millennium BC, and there we find them in the late Hellenistic period, all of a sudden with Olympic gods attached to them. So really, the animals are only these two as far as the taxa are concerned. It's very difficult to do the type of interplay that had been done for prehistoric periods in Anatolia, or the one that Ben Arbuckle has done more recently, also down for the Bronze Age. The sheep and goat to bovines ratio is the one well known for agropastoral communities in the plateau. So if there are deposits from banqueting connected with these sanctuaries, we didn't find them. What we found in one room that only had remains from banquets associated with the sanctuary, in fact, is exclusively sheep and goat portions of say after 6 months to 2.5 years old animals. I hope that gives a good idea.
No, I think that's a very thorough response. Thanks. And moving from animals to plants, do you have any evidence for the distilling of alcohol? And if so, approximately when?
Distilling is tough. You know, if you look for animals, so for wine production, that's something, but distillation is a much more complicated process, implying a technology that for which we have no clear evidence at the site. There are some written evidence, as you know, from southern Mesopotamia at the end of the 2nd millennium, but I am not aware. So, and for sure not in the archaeobotanical record that
Okay.
could help us answering this challenging question.
Oh,
so
good.
winemaking and spirits at a higher level of alcohol are two quite different processes also to be found in archaeology.
Thanks. James, we've got a question for you having to do with the evidence for lamp production, and I think also for the chalk vessel production you have there. Are these industries, do you think, purely for local consumption, therefore typical of villages of the sort you're investigating, or are these central locations for wider distribution of products? Do you have an estimate on that?
I don't have an estimate. I have a guess. I think they're for wider distribution, although because we keep finding these soft chalk vessel production areas, I'm beginning to be suspicious that there are more out there to be found. That we may be distributing them, but there may not be one central distribution or one central manufacturing area. There's just enough of that soft nari, soft chalk around that people are digging into it around Nazareth, around Reina, and other nearby places. By the way, that waste, however, it provides another industry. So they're making lamp molds out of it at Shikhin, and I suspect other places. And we have evidence that they're making loom weights out of those same types of cores. And they're there for the taking. Like I said, if you can get to one before it gets destroyed, like the two at Reina, you can harvest just piles of these things.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thanks. Kate, we have a question for you. There was a disc in your image of ceramics and stone tools, and we have a viewer who's wondering what it was used for.
We don't really know. I know which one she means, the sort of flat disc. Is it like maybe this tall? My suspicion is that it's a blank for drilling through and producing something else, but what that would be, I don't really know. And because so many of our ground stone objects are in, we find them at different phases of the production process, that's why I think it's probably, since it doesn't look like other things we have, probably some on its way to being something else.
Sounds reasonable. James, another question for you. Is Shikhin related to Shekinah? And is there any evidence for worship of a goddess?
It is not related to that name. It's related to a word in Aramaic for pits or maybe caves, something like that. So we're digging into pits. What was the second question? Oh, a worship of a goddess.
Goddess worship, yeah.
Yeah, goddess worship. We don't have anything that we could interpret as that. In fact, we have the absence of evidence of any kind of religion that would be different from Judaism. So we don't have any images of human beings or of animals, the exception being coins. We have the heads of people, of course, on coins. If you're digging a site that you think is inhabited by non-Jews, who are good religious folks who are worshiping many gods, well, they don't seem to mind making images of humans and animals of gods in various media, and you expect to find them, and you expect to find erotic scenes on lamps and those kinds of things. And when you're digging in a village or a town with a largely Jewish population in the Hellenistic through the Roman period, in any case, you don't expect to find many of those things, far fewer in any case. And that's what we have at Shikhin. We have basically an absence of those things. I joke that I found one lamp that was badly calcified. It was a discus lamp, so there was lots of room for decoration on it, but I couldn't quite make out the decoration. I said, am I seeing an erotic scene or am I looking at a crab? And you could tell I was trying to count legs.
Sorry, I can't help you with that, but
Yeah, well, it'll remain a mystery.
Right. Kate, we have another question. Could you repeat your conclusions about your site? Was there a slide you had outlining them?
I didn't have a slide outlined. I should say this is actually something that we are putting into press, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. It's going into a book being edited as a, it's going to be a chapter in a book being edited as a publication of a session from the 2020/21 ICANE meeting. And so basically where I left it is that our next step for the project is to try and understand at the village level at Makounda how the politics of maintaining this plays out. And this is actually part of our main theoretical work for this season is what does this need to look like at a household and village level? And that's what we're working on next. That's where I left it.
Good, thanks. Lorenzo, when's your next field season?
Well, it will start after Bayram, Steve. It's I think we'll be there between the 15th to 18th of July, and we'll stay there for the season for the 2 months. There will be some operation running in the first month, some other later on. So, for example, for the Iron Age cultic building, we would like to excavate really in the first month and see what happens with our room 7. And but in general, yes. So mid-July to mid-September is this year.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, to our audience, thank you for joining us this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you to our speakers, to the sponsors who've enabled this webinar tonight. We will be in touch, that is ASOR will be in touch via email about upcoming events. You should keep an eye out for them on the ASOR website as well. Mark your calendars for the April 24 webinar with Oystein LaBianca, Elizabeth Osinga and Daryl Roll talking about preserving cultural heritage at Hispan and Jamal Jordan. We'd like to remind you, you can purchase the link for the recording of any past FOA webinar, buy the bundle of all the webinars from the 21 and 20 season. You can view any webinar on using ASOR's online library platform. The easiest way to access the library is to register for the 2022 meetings in Boston and virtually. That library includes all the past FOA webinars, the recordings of all 11 lectures from the Webinarathon to Endow Diversity at ASOR 3-day event, and all the recorded content from the 2020 and 2021 virtual annual meetings, including over 800 paper, poster, and workshop presentations and 2 virtual museum tours. It's a lot of information, a lot of depth to go through. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Good night.